Hi folks, we are back. Looks like we are back to video here, and we are on week 6 for AP Lit Vocab. As you know, I tried to theme the terms, and this week they are different types of texts within literature. So let me share my screen, and hopefully you will be able to technology. There we go. You'll be able to see here now what we are talking about. So we're going to start this week with the term didactic literature. And I put that umbrella there because, well, guess what? We have an umbrella term. And didactic literature is just simply literature that instructs its readers. So it often teaches lessons about how to live a moral life. Writers will often communicate their views about what is morally right and wrong. Sometimes those ideas in didactic literature are stated directly, and other times they present their ideas through the examples, and the ideas are more implied. Now, definitely several of the other terms that I'll share with you today are examples of didactic literature, including the next two terms. So an anecdote is a type of didactic literature, again, because didactic is an umbrella term. And an anecdote is simply a brief story. It focuses on a single revealing event. Sometimes anecdotes are taken from the life of a real person. I just think about the fact that you tell anecdotes every single day. When you're sitting at lunch with your friends, you turn to them and tell them what happened last night at home or at the volleyball game or wherever. And so you're essentially telling them an anecdote because there's usually a point to your story. You're telling them what happened. It's based on your real life, which an anecdote often is. It's got human characters, and sometimes it can be interesting or amusing or even funny. So I put George Washington and the cherry tree because I think about that as an anecdote we learned as a kid, the fact that he had to learn about honesty and he could not tell a lie. Our next term is parable. And if you regularly attend church, this might be a term that you know. A parable is simply a short tale, and it teaches through example. It usually teaches a moral or even a religious lesson. It somehow teaches how people ought to live. Okay. So often the characters are in some sort of moral dilemma where they have to make a decision and then deal with the consequences, good or bad, of that decision. It is usually a brief tale. It's kind of succinct. It's not long and drawn out. And I put a couple of different images here that represent parables from the Bible, like the parable of the Good Samaritan and the parable of the prodigal son. Those are probably a couple of famous parables. Parody, this is such a fun term. And I may, on Friday, end up showing you a parody video in class. So a parody is a work where the author imitates the language and form of another work, and the purpose of parody is always to ridicule. It's always to make fun of the original text. So that weird guy on the left, if you don't know him, is Weird Al Yankovic, and he is famous for his parodies. Look him up. One of my favorite ones is that Weird Al does is a parody of the song Blurred Lines, and it's called Word Crimes. It's really funny and obviously related to English, so I love it. He's got a lot of really, really funny ones if you've never seen some of his. On the right-hand side of your screen is an image of the Reduced Shakespeare Company. So what they do is they take they take Shakespeare's plays and pare them down into just a few minutes and kind of highlight the funny bits. But it's really meant to, again, make fun of Shakespeare's work. And that one you're seeing on the right is an image from Romeo and Juliet. So parody makes fun of the original work. A eulogy, this looks really morbid, and it kind of is, but a eulogy is simply a speech given at the memorial or funeral service in remembrance of somebody who has died. It's usually given shortly after someone who's died. Again, it can be at the service or literally at the grave site. Sometimes a eulogy is given. There's several different terms that kind of sound alike. Not that you would ever necessarily read a eulogy, but I think it's a good term to know to sort of separate that from some of the other types of literature that you might more likely see. This is a term I've seen kind of thrown in as a decoy sometimes. Legend is our next term here. And a legend is simply a story that's handed down through time and it's accepted as generally as true or mostly true, but in fact, it's a mix of fact and fiction. Often we have something, whether it's archaeological findings or some literature evidence that parts of that tale may have been true, but in general, it is a mix of fact and fiction. There's some debate about whether things like Bigfoot, the abominable snowman, Loch Ness Monster, if those things are legends. Kind of depends who you talk to. You know, people think we have evidence for some of those creatures, and other people say absolutely no way, it's a hoax. But sometimes those kinds of stories, like stories of Bigfoot, are also accepted as legends. Myths. There's several different types of myths, but probably the most popular ones are creation myths, myths that explain how something came to be, or myths that involve like gods and goddesses, like Greek and Roman mythology. So typically a myth is a story that concerns a superhuman being, and it deals with events that need sort of an explanation, especially the creation myths and the myths of how things came to be. There's usually, well, take the spider on your screen. That's Anansi the spider. And Anansi comes from myths in Africa. And he's sort of this anthropomorphized spider. And he teaches the African people a lot of different stories. So one of them is why spiders hide in dark corners. And so this whole myth leads up to the explanation of why something is the way it is. Why do spiders hide in dark corners? Why does the leopard have spots? How did the earth come to be? Why is the zebra black and white? So a lot of myths involve animals or nature. They attempt to explain a phenomenon or a strange occurrence. And then kind of, as a different kind of myth, then you also have the myths of Greek and Roman mythology, but they're a little bit different than sort of the myths of the natural world. An epitaph, excuse me, an epitaph is a short text that honors a deceased person. And typically we think of an epitaph as being inscribed on someone's tombstone. Many writers, poets, people of political ranking have written their own tombstones. And Mel Blanc, who is the one you see on the right, his says, "That's all, folks." You might recognize him from Looney Tunes. And then Winston Churchill has a famous epitaph, kind of a humorous one. He said, "I am ready to meet my maker. Whether my maker is prepared for the great ordeal of meeting me is another matter." Okay, so again, short text honoring the deceased person, usually no more than a line or two, and Usually they're inscribed on their tombstones. Frame story. I like this one. This one's called, frame story is basically, in a nutshell, story within a story, okay? So for instance, in both two very popular frame stories, the Canterbury Tales, which is English, and the Decameron, which is Italian, the outer frame, as we call it, is about characters going on a journey or a pilgrimage. A lot of times these characters will be going on a religious pilgrimage. And so on the way, like literally these characters are walking to this place because they weren't driving in their cars. And they are walking to wherever they are going, which is probably going to take the course of quite a few days. And they need to pass the time, so they decide to tell stories. So the stories within the Canterbury Tales, the stories within the Decameron are really the stories that they tell along the way. So let's say that I'm going on a journey with John and Joe. So again, along the way, we're like, hey, guys, let's tell stories to pass the time. So I say, today I'm going to tell a story about baseball. And then I start telling that story about baseball. And when I'm telling that story about baseball, that's what we call the inner frame. And then when I'm done with my story at the end, Joe might say, that was a great story, Mrs. White, but I've got a story that can beat your story. And my story is about plants. And then Joe tells his story. So we have this outer frame of us going on this journey, and then this inner frame of us telling stories to pass the time along on our journey. An invocation, this is another one you might be familiar with if you have any sort of religious knowledge. And it's simply a prayer or a statement that calls for help from a god or a goddess. This could be as simple as one line in an opening of a text, or it could be that a whole text is an invocation. A lot of times in a text, like the opening line might say like, you know, oh God, or this expression sort of right away in the beginning of a story that they need help from a higher being, okay, from a higher being, or the gods and goddesses, for instance. Fable. So a fable, the biggest thing with a fable is that definitely contains animal creatures, mythical creatures, plants, and inanimate objects that can be brought to life, and they are anthropomorphized. And in a fable, which is a succinct fictional story, it does illustrate a moral. And at the end, a lot of times, the moral is very explicitly written out. So, for instance, in the really famous fable about the tortoise and the hare, at the end of the story, it literally lays out the moral by saying slow and steady wins the race. And a fable almost always does that at the end of it. But animal characters, they're simple in expression, but they convey a much sort of deeper meaning to life. So fables are really meant to be understood by both kids and adults alike. And Aesop's fables are probably the most famous of fables. Homily, another sort of religious-esque term here. A homily is simply a commentary following the reading of scripture. So if you've ever been to church, a lot of times what will happen is they'll read from the religious text, and then the holy man will kind of step out from behind the pulpit, and he'll give a practical message or an inspirational message related to the scripture that he just read. So a homily is not meant to be theological. It's meant to be practical. It's meant to be inspirational. It's meant to inspire the congregation and send them away with sort of things to be thinking about. And we have epistle. An epistle is essentially just a letter, but usually not just any letter. It's a formal letter. It's a didactic letter. It's one, that's meant to teach. Probably the most famous example of epistles are actually in the Bible. the letters written in the New Testament from the different apostles to the Christians are all examples of these very formal, didactic letters meant to teach. And that's epistle. And finally, we have a satire. I love satire. It's great. So oftentimes, first of all, satire and parody get confused. Remember how I said that parody, the purpose is to ridicule. Satire has a different purpose. Although satire may be funny, the larger purpose is for constructive criticism. It can use humor or wit as a weapon. Often the purpose of something that is a satire is supposed to try to shame or guilt individuals into improvement. So the purpose isn't just for entertainment, it's more to make a change. And irony and sarcasm are absolutely involved in satire. A couple of famous satires are Animal Farm, which is a political satire. Again, it's sort of poking fun at the government, but with the idea to say like a change is needed. The other very, very famous example of a satire is called A Modest Proposal, and the image on your right-hand side is kind of from that text. It's a great little text. It is about the poor and about people with children and how we can use those children to prevent poverty. And you might see, it's a little bit morbid, but that the child is on the plate. And so one of the things it talks about that's kind of controversial and satirical is the fact that we could eat our children, and that would help make us not so poor because we wouldn't have more mouths to feed. So it would actually provide double duty in the fact that we would be full because we would eat our children and we wouldn't have an extra mouth to feed. So again, sort of making fun of the ways in that case how the government was handling poverty. So that is it. That takes care of week 6 vocab for us. Please watch the video. Please bring questions. I'm trying to speed up my talking a little bit here so I get through them quicker, but you absolutely may have questions, so make sure that you bring them to class on Friday. See you soon.